Hello and welcome to Ask an Author with Julia Kelly. We're a moment late because we were chatting so much beforehand. We're very, very excited about this, but I am really excited to introduce a fantastic writing team who has just been, you know, entertaining me to no end before this. And I know you guys are really going to enjoy this conversation, especially if you've had a chance to read their fantastic book, The Personal Librarian. Would you like to introduce yourselves and then tell us perhaps a little bit about this wonderful book?
Well, I'm Victoria Christopher Murray, one of the co-author of The Personal Librarian, and
I'm Marie Benedict. And
Welcome.
you tell us a little bit
oh, it's me. Okay. So the Personal Librarian is the story of Belle DeCosta Green, our Belle DeCosta Green. She was the personal librarian, and we'll talk more today, I'm sure, about what that really means, to the famous financier, J.P. Morgan. In the early 1900s. And during the course of her life, she became one of the most powerful people in the art and book world. But she was only able to rise up to that position, that lofty position, by hiding her true identity. She was actually a Black woman passing as white. And it was more than just hiding her identity. It was really suppressing her teaching and her heritage. Her father was Richard T. Greener. He was the first Black graduate of Harvard. He was a well-known during his lifetime activist for equality. And her mother came from an equally important rich heritage. She was part of a many generations, a free community of color, affluent, educated, and Belle DeCosta Green had to hide that part of her identity in her life in order to pass as white and serve in this capacity.
We're going to have lots of opportunity for questions. So if you guys do have questions, please drop them in the comments because I know this book has done so well, and congratulations on all the success with it.
Thank
I see
you.
you guys all over the internet and Facebook. Can you tell me a little bit about what it is that drew you to this book and why you think maybe readers are connecting to that as well?
Well, here I go again. Sorry. So I know what Victoria's going to say. She's going to say the book started with you, so you have to go. So I actually became aware of Belle over 2 decades ago. I don't want to say 3, but it could be actually 3 decades ago. It was a long time ago. Well, I was a commercial litigator in New York City. I worked for large law firms. And it wasn't the work that I was called to do. I had always loved history and untold stories. And I thought that was what I was going to do. And I kind of got swept into the world of becoming a lawyer. And I was sort of searching for what my next path would be. And I would kind of escape and seek solace in the cultural institutions of New York City. The Morgan Library in particular was a favorite. For people who have not had the delight of visiting this institution, it was built by J.P. Morgan in the early 1900s to house his collection of rare and priceless manuscripts. It is honestly one of the most beautiful libraries in the world. It's sort of a crimson and gilt affair with gorgeous frescoed ceilings and walnut handmade bookshelves and priceless books everywhere, Renaissance paintings on the wall. And one day when I was there, a docent happened to mention to me the fact of Belle, that there had been this woman in the early 1900s who served as JP Morgan's really right-hand person, not just a librarian in the sense that we kind of think of a librarian, but a curator, a collector, a representative, a negotiator, and so much more to him personally, which we can get into. But, and I was struck, I was really awestruck actually, because here was this woman who held such an incredible position at a time when women didn't even have the right to vote. And I keep kind of a running list of historical women that I want to investigate and potentially write about. That's kind of the mission I'm on with my solo projects. I write about historical women who've left a legacy, kind of excavate their stories from the past. And so in the years that followed, as I turned to writing, I would dip into the research of the women on my list, and I started to research Belle DeCosta Green, and I learned that she was even more remarkable than I could have imagined. As I said earlier, she was actually not only a woman. She was actually a woman who was passing, and that she came from this incredible background. And it was then that I really knew that I needed and wanted to find a partner to write this book with me. I can imagine a lot of things as a white writer of fiction, but it's not appropriate or right for me to try and envision what it would be like to move about the world as a Black woman. Then or now, right? There's so much involved in that that I'm still learning. And so it was around that time that I read Victoria's novel, Stand Your Ground, which you should read if you haven't, not to be too, bossy about it, but it's wonderful. It's hard and good and such a mix of things. It looks at this terrible issue in our country of the shooting of young Black men. And it looks at it from the perspective of the boy's mother and the wife of the white police officer who shot the boy. And it was really an eye-opener for me. It was such a different, fresh look, a different perspective than really what I had been accustomed to reading. And I thought, well, maybe this could be my partner. So I put together a little synopsis, treatment, whatever you want, and maybe a couple chapters. I don't even remember now. And I sent it to her through our agents. And then Victoria will tell you what happened.
So I received this. My agent sent me an email with the treatment, and she said an author, Marie Benedict, would like to do a collaboration with you. And so I was interested because I've done collaborations before. I've done 6 books with Rashonda Tate Billingsley. So I knew how to do it and how it would work. And I love writing with someone else, even more than I like writing by myself. Having a partner really helps. So the first thing I did was Google Marie because I didn't know about her. And I found this I found all this information about this woman who was discovering other women who had been lost inside the folds of history. She was a historical fiction writer. So that was the first thing I didn't understand. But there was another thing, the big thing that I didn't understand. So I called my agent back and I said, this Marie Benedict she's seen a picture of me. Like, does she know who I am? Is she looking for a different Victoria Christopher Murray? So my agent said, she knows you're Black. Can you just look at the treatment? Well, it still took me about 2 months to do that because the first page of the treatment was all about JP Morgan and I couldn't connect to him. I wasn't interested in him at all. And I kept putting it aside. I didn't even get to the second page. And my agent kept saying, when are you going to read it? And finally she said, you are not too busy. 2 months have passed. Can you please read it? And so finally I forced myself because I didn't want to go past the first page, but the second page was much more interesting because now it was about Belle DaCosta Green. Still didn't know anything about her or didn't know what I thought was the most important thing about her for the story, because Marie had buried the lead. She had hidden the most important part at the end that made me sit up in my chair when I found out that she had accomplished all of this because she was indeed not white. She was a Black woman passing as white. I could not get on the telephone fast enough. I called my agent and I was a little concerned that maybe I had blown it because so much time had passed. And but she said, no, we'll get the two of you together. And Julia, from the first minute of the phone call, I knew. Yeah. I liked her immediately. I liked Marie immediately. And I knew we'd be able to do it together. I wasn't sure if Marie knew because she had never done collaborations before, but I knew it was going to be wonderful if we did it together.
And I knew it too. I mean, Victoria and I connected, and I'm doing this even though I'm not really in that section of our talk, Victoria, sorry. But I knew immediately. I mean, it was so easy. We just eased right into a very comfortable, almost like the best way I can describe it is this. One of our early conversations, I had brought one of my good friends with me on. Victoria and I during this time were always on the road, each of us, which is actually very important to our story. And I brought one of my friends with me on one of my trips, and we were talking on the phone. And after I got off, my friend was like, "Gosh, how long have you guys known each other?" I mean, like, are you old college friends or whatever? I was like, no, we've actually never met. We just had this very easy, comfortable familiarity, but it was so much more than that. Like I knew from the start that not only did I like Victoria, but, she was as committed from the very beginning to honoring Belle, telling the best story that we could about her. And that was the most important thing, that it wasn't going to be about who wrote what section or anything like that. I think, in fact, what she said is, there's no ego in this on my end. And that meant so much, because my goal always has been to honor these women, right? If we were writing, Marvel comics, these would be the heroines, and we're writing their origin stories, how they came to be these magnificent women who left us these legacies. And then, of course, I knew that she knew how to collaborate. We had another interview earlier today, and Victoria said, she's like, it was a little audacious, I mean, she didn't know what I didn't know what I was doing, or that Victoria would want to do it, but I just went for it. And
it really is bold to say, I'm going to write a book with a person I've never met. But this is an important story, so I'm going to go get this stranger, and we're going to do this together. And I'm so glad. That was a big risk. I mean, I don't think I thought about it that way before, because we connected so immediately that it seemed like, okay, that was the right thing to do. But today it kind of hit me that was a bold thing to do.
Crazy thing to do. And of course, I mean, you've collaborated before, and a lot of people who've collaborated and it went sideways, so I mean, who knows? But first of all, I felt like I did know you, because even though, I mean, obviously I hadn't met you at first, I had read Stand Your Ground, and I knew someone who had written this thoughtfully, this well, had really wanted to get at this complicated, really charged topic by so many different perspectives to really understand it. I just knew somebody who had written this book. I would like that person. I felt like I knew you a little bit.
I did an honest novel, and I did.
Yeah,
and
really did.
But it was good. I'm so grateful.
Oh, I'm so grateful. Are you kidding?
Wants to get in here, Marie?
I do. I feel like I'm.
Are you here, Julia?
Over cocktails. So,
yeah, true.
So I think it's fitting to sort of talk a little bit, and maybe pivot a little bit to the woman at the center of the story, because you talk about boldness, and she is in some ways boldness personified, even though she is hiding this great secret from most of the people in her life. So can you tell us a little bit more about Belle and the Belle that we meet at the beginning of the story, and maybe a little bit of the journey that she goes on, without, of course, giving us too many spoilers?
The woman that we meet at the beginning of the story is the daughter of Richard T. Greener, who is known in the Black community, maybe not by name, but somebody people talk about, the first Black graduate of Harvard University, he was brilliant, but he was also an activist. He was very active in the move for the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and just equality, as we were coming out of this period of 400 years of slavery. And then on her mother's side, she was the woman who, her name, Genevieve Fleet, or Genevieve, I don't know how to pronounce her first name, Fleet, from the Fleet family, who was had a long line of free, educated Blacks. The men were all engineers, the women were teachers. So she came from this great legacy of two brilliant families who had come together, and her father was this well-known orator who actually ended up becoming the dean of Howard University's law school. And so that's who she is when we first meet her, except there had been a breach in the family, because when she was a teenager, her parents, who had fought together for civil rights, had a little bit of a split, because once the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was overturned, her parents saw it two different ways. Her father saw it as a way to just continue the fight, a reason we just have to keep fighting. Her mother said, I'm out. It will always be separate. We will never be equal. And what her mother wanted most over anything in the world was she didn't want to be white. She wanted to be equal. And that was the only tool she had to give equality to her children. And so the book almost opens up there at that fork in the road where all these years Belle has lived as a Black young girl with a Black family that she's loved and adored. And now her mother makes a decision to suddenly take a left turn, and now she'll be living as white. And so that's where it opens up. She's gone to college, we're not quite sure, teachers college. She's been a librarian at Princeton University, and now she's with JP Morgan.
In the scariest job interview I think I've seen, committed to people.
Certainly one of the scarier ones of that time period, for sure. I mean, and here you have, Belle had this incredible opportunity, right? Belle was definitely, Victoria describes her often as Black girl magic, right? And that has multiple meanings on multiple levels. But one of the things that she was incredible at was gleaning everything she could from a situation and then going into a new situation, reading the room and delivering the performance that was sought from her. And, she really, during her time at Princeton University, she loved the sort of illuminated manuscripts, the original printed books. And they had a wonderful collection there. And she gleaned everything that she could. And she forged this friendship with JP Morgan's nephew, Junius Morgan. And when his uncle, with whom he was very close, they were members of the Grolier Club together, which, just as a side note, they did just ask us to speak. I don't know if you saw that invitation, but that's a whole other thing. I'm sorry, I just threw that at Victoria. Yeah. It's an oldest bibliophilic club in America. And so Junius was JP's advisor. And he knew his uncle was looking for a librarian for his personal collection, and he suggested Belle. And so Belle, in her infinite nimbleness, prepared herself for the interview, goes into the space, and as she's walking in there, she's remembering all the guidance that her mother has given her, which are really the rules to follow, so you won't be discovered as a Black person, among other things. And she has this encounter. I mean, she's this beautiful little diminutive person, and JP Morgan is like a behemoth. And I don't mean that just in terms of his power. He's huge. He's like 6'2", and he's barrel chested, and he sits behind this huge desk with like lion paws. And so, that moment, but Victoria looked at it, and, when we came together to write, what we didn't know in that initial conversation, but we soon learned, is that our strengths and weaknesses really complement each other well. And so for me, I love a first draft. I love to get it on the paper, and then I don't really want to see it again. And Victoria loves to take it at that point and make it rich and thicken it. And we both did both roles throughout this. But in that particular scene, I think I kicked it off, and Victoria looked at it, and she's like, as she's kind of layering it and thinking in it, she sees something that I missed entirely, which is that JP Morgan would have looked at Belle as he looked at anything else he was acquiring as a piece of art. And suddenly she's drafted this scene where he's, circling her like a hawk in its prey, as he's like deciding whether she's worthy of acquiring. And of course that has multi-layers of meaning in this particular situation.
Of course. The power dynamic between the two of them is fascinating, because in this book you really see a woman who is sort of in some ways coming into her own and starting to own her expertise and her power throughout this book, because it does stretch over quite a few years of her life. And you also see a man who's sort of towards the end of his life, but he still exerts this incredible amount of social and literal economic power. And in some cases, we see him sort of ferrying the country through an economic crisis. But he's also a very erratic man as well. Can you talk a bit about the relationship between the two of them, both as you wrote it and also as you found it in the historical records?
Well, how did we find it in historical records? Because that's something that Marie and I talked about a lot as we were discovering more and more about Bell. Of course, we would discover more and more about J.P. Morgan. And we discovered that she wasn't just his employee. They're talking about layers. Their relationship had so many layers. It started out employee, employer. But then he soon realized that she was brilliant. So he was able to include her into all parts of his life, his confidant. He even talked to her about the financial situations and what he thought. She thought she read the Bible to him. They played cards together. She was part of the family. I mean, and then there was this sexual tension between them. Just because, and even though he was so much older than she was. But Marie, what did the historical record show?
Well, I mean, that's kind of one of the tricky things about this particular book. Belle, rightly so, was concerned. She made this decision to pass. And as the years went on, the sacrifice really had to be worth it. It was a huge sacrifice to pass. She was leaving behind her father's teachings, her this wonderful community that she had been a part of as a child, and her mother's family. And so leaving a legacy was critical, we think, to her. That's sort of our Belle. And by that, we mean not just the rich man's collection, which she built up. She helped build up JP's collection, but then ultimately turning that institution into a public institution, which really required her to finagle Jack Morgan into donating millions and millions of dollars of collectibles and a building. But in any event, so towards the end of her life, she destroyed most of her personal correspondence. There's certainly professional correspondence, which I've seen, which remains at the Morgan and floating around out there. The biggest bulk of personal correspondence that still exists was in the hands, and we can talk about this relationship. Her most important romantic relationship was with an art critic, Bernard Berenson. And even though she had asked him to burn all of her letters, he of course did not. And he kept them at his villa in Italy. It's called I Tatti. He had been a Harvard graduate himself, and upon his death, he left the villa to Harvard. So those letters became they became part of Harvard's collection. And those letters are the ones that really, they wrote each other often. They wrote each other over decades. Even when the relationship was no longer romantic, they were very close professionally on some levels, and she really relied on his advice. And she would talk to him about, it was almost like a journal, right? Like she would write to him like she would write in a journal. And she would talk to him about JP's possessiveness or the things he made her go to socially and otherwise. Those currently are only available at I Tatti. I was going to go myself to I Tatti and look at the letters before the pandemic. And then, of course, that became impossible. But we are very fortunate that Heidi Artizoni, who wrote a wonderful biography of Belle called An Illuminated Life. It's right here. I'll show it. You can see all my little flags. That she had access to those letters. And so she excerpted some of them, she referred to them, and that really had to take the place of our own personal study of those original letters. Now, of course, a little too late for Victoria and I, but wonderful in general. Those letters there's going to be a big kind of tribute to Belle, I think, at the Morgan Library in 2024 to honor their 100 years as a public institution. And as part of that, they're digitizing all those letters. So everyone will be able to read them, which personally, I can't wait to get our hands on them, but I'm excited for lots of people to get to see them. But, there are so many ways to kind of figure out what Belle was up to, even without her personal record. She was a well-known public figure in her day. There are lots of newspaper accounts, magazine articles talking about where she is when, what weddings she attended, what balls she went to, what ship she was on. And of course, there's correspondence from other people that reflect seeing her at different events and those sorts of things. So, and she was really, except when he traveled, at JP Morgan's side anytime he was in New York. So to track his movements and his and his activities was another way to kind of get at what she was doing and what they were doing together.
How do you handle the balance between historical truth and fact and artistic license? Because I know at the end of the book, you do mention in the author's note, there are certain things, dates have slid slightly, and I'm assuming that's for continuity or to kind of
Yeah.
move the narrative forward, because nobody's life works in a straight narrative path,
No.
right? But how do you come together and decide, this is something that's really important. We're going to stick very closely to what we found in the records, and maybe this needs to be filled in a little bit to make the narrative make sense or to raise tension or something along those lines.
Well, that scene that you were talking about, the interview, to me is a good example. Because even when we had to fill in the fiction, we stayed as close to the facts as we could. And what I mean by that is, as we studied Belle, we knew about her personality, we knew about her background and what she would most likely do in a situation, and the same for Morgan. And so the interview, we knew what day that she had the interview, and we knew that she was hired. But obviously, we don't know what went on and what was said in there. So what we did was try to stay as close as we could to the historical facts of what we knew about them, and their personalities. And so then it was very easy to fill in those those parts of it. Do you know what I mean? We know little things, and we just continued to fill them in, sticking as close as we could to who we knew them to be. Because even though this is fiction, Marie and I really wanted to tell Belle's story. She's still our Belle because she's in our imagination, or at least those kinds of things. But we tried to stay as close to her as we could. Wouldn't you agree, Marie?
Yeah, I mean, anytime we had facts, we would utilize them, right? I mean, I describe, Victoria's heard me to say this a million times, but like the facts are really the architecture upon which the story hangs, right? Whether it's something specific and smallish, like the date upon which they interviewed, or a larger sort of socio-political setting in which they live, or the kind of food that they ate, or the shoes that they wore. I mean, all of those things are sort of the structure, but there's always places within the structure that you don't know, like a conversation at an interview. Some of the things are small, some of the things are huge. Some of the things you don't know and you just really want to happen, and so you add. We had some satisfying ends. We'll just put it that way. I don't want to say too much. And we really do try to acknowledge that in the historical notes at the end of the book. I think one area that kind of bears specific focus is, like, we don't really know how Belle felt about passing, for example. One of the things we really don't have is how she felt about her big secret, right? That's, even if we had seen all of Bernard's letters, she wouldn't have written about that to Bernard. He probably suspected it, but we don't think that was ever really confirmed between them. And maybe it's floating around out there in somebody's shoebox in a closet. Belle has some letters talking about how she felt about passing. I would love to see those, but I haven't heard of them. And it's in that area that you kind of have to, as Victoria said, extrapolate from the character. And then you have to fill in the rest with what you might learn from the more general historical record. And, that's where there's some wonderful historical research that has been undertaken that you can look at. So, for example, Alison Hobbs, a wonderful writer and historian, wrote A Chosen Exile about passing, really studying records of many people who have passed, and kind of, I don't want to say cataloging, that's not the right word, but really delving into each of the different sacrifices that they endured, the sorts of things that they had to suffer through as they followed that pathway, which was very often the only one available to them if they wanted any modicum of equality, right? So, and we use things like that kind of as a prompt for our discussions about what it would have been like to pass. But we also had personal information. Victoria had a lot of familial, anecdotal information about her own family's experiences.
Yes, and I didn't have anyone in my family who passed as a lifestyle, but my grandmother passed as convenience. So she was very fair. And so if a person assumed she was white in a certain situation, she did not correct them. If she walked into the bank and they assumed she was white and pointed her to the white line, or she would never correct them because it was more convenient to do that. And then I always say a Black person of a certain age, everybody knows someone who's passed. Everybody does. And so we've all heard this other stories of people who lived that lifestyle and the things that happened to them and how their families felt. So all of that, Marie and I talked about, and we were able to put it into the book.
It's interesting also because there is this schism within Belle's family that you write about. And I'm guessing from the historical record, we don't know exactly what caused it, but it does come up around the time that her father and mother split, and her mother and the rest of the family were living in New York and were passing. So I imagine that's a jumping off point for kind of exploring that theme of family that you have throughout the book, both with Belle's family and also with the Morgans as well. We see two families kind of, in some ways, struggling, I think, being family members.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we don't know, obviously we weren't in the Greener home to be there for the sort of arguments we can imagine that Genevieve and Richard might have had over this slow kind of decision. They moved into a white neighborhood. The kids went to schools that were predominantly white. We don't know. And that's where a lot of the fiction comes in. But there are letters after the fact in which he talks about her decision, how he isn't happy about the decision. What then happens between him and his children after the fact, we don't know that. He does, we know he stops living with the family. We know eventually he takes a posting in almost like as an ambassador in Russia, and is out of the continent for a significant period of time. He actually goes so far as to have another family. Even though he never divorced Genevieve, he meets and has a common law marriage with a Japanese woman, and they have a family. So there's a long period of time when there's both a sort of an emotional and physical break between Richard and the children. But we don't know how Belle felt about passing, but we could imagine how someone who was so close with her father and had been steeped in this rich tradition of her mother and these powerful teachings and beliefs of her father, how she might have felt in this situation as she's going about the world as a white woman.
We have a question from a reader or a viewer, Arlene, that maybe ties into this a little bit, talking about sort of thinking about how Belle may have felt and filling in some of those details. Arlene asks, if you were to ask Belle one question, what answer would one question you want to know the answer to, what would it be?
I would like to know how she felt about passing, but in terms of with her father. I would like to know, how did she feel about it as in relation to her father? Because Marie and I love to believe, and we have reason to, that she and her father were very close because she was a child that followed in his footsteps, his love of art, and he was a librarian at one point, she became a librarian. And so we just believe that there was a connection, and she could still see all the things he was doing. She heard about what he was doing. And I'd like to know how she felt about that. I think we probably got that really close in the book.
I would love to know that too. I would love, people ask us questions like, is there one historical figure you'd like to talk to? It would be Belle DaCosta Green for sure, because I would love to know if this is such the crux of her identity, right? And we worked so hard and had so many hours of conversations over her passing and how she felt at every turn in the road. And boy, would I like to know that we got that right. I do have one other question I'd like to know the answer to. Did they or didn't they with JP Morgan? I would love to know that. Even though I don't think it's as important in the long run, I would just be so curious about that.
Because all we have in history, without giving away anything in the book, all we have is someone interviewing Belle and asking, did you with JP Morgan? And her response is, we tried, and she laughed. And so for months, Marie and I were like, what does that mean?
Right, we had no idea.
Because that laugh at the end kind of, what does that mean? Is that a good laugh, a bad laugh? And so that was fun.
Mischievous laugh. And we wrote it, right, Victoria, a whole bunch of different ways. I mean, we wrote it.
It's one thing that we talked about constantly, you know, did they or didn't they? And we wrote it a lot of different ways, but we felt there had to be, the way he was as a man and the way he treated women and the way she looked, and we know there was something. So we'll let everybody look in the book.
But that's another great example of fiction. Nobody really knows for sure, unless, a document can always emerge after the fact that could shed a lot of light on something. But as far as what's out there right now, we don't know what happened. And that's really a great example of fiction, and knowing your characters and extrapolating from the time period and the record, and then kind of what you want to happen.
Yeah. Awesome. And I think what's important in this kind of fiction is we have that as the fact, and staying as close as we could. There weren't very many times when we put situations in there that we don't have any record of. Now, there was one that we had to do just for our own.
That was for us. It says it in the, you have to read it, but then it does say in the author's note, we do say that we made that part up. It was necessary.
It was.
We
have another question from Anissa, talking more about the writing process side of this. What hurdles did you all face writing this book during the pandemic? So who wants to jump into that? Because I imagine this was a lot of Zoom calls.
Oh my goodness, the stock went up because of us. If anybody wants to know why the stock of Zoom went so high, what was so interesting about it is, when we wrote the first draft, and we wrote it together and had a great experience with it, both Marie and I were constantly on the road with our solo projects and doing other things, but we were writing in between. And then the pandemic came and set us down. The furthest that we could move was from the living room to the bedroom to the kitchen. That was the extent of our traveling. And so that was a good thing, because before we were kind of talking to each other in between planes and while we were packing for the next day, now we were home. So we had longer, more in-depth. I didn't even realize that we weren't having in-depth conversations.
I know, right?
Pandemic. And then we had to sit down and talk, because now we were in edits.
Right.
And so we had to roll up our sleeves anyway. So that was the first blessing, but something else came with that, right, Marie?
Yeah, I mean, it was beneficial to the book. It certainly wasn't a blessing, but it was the racial unrest that was really unfolding around us. And every day, we were already on the phone talking about, as we were doing the edits and rewriting and adding and shifting, we were already talking about race so extensively, but we were talking about historical racism, and suddenly very real modern day racism is unfolding around us. And these issues, we are talking for the first hour of our multi-hour conversations, we're talking about what's happening in our world. And Victoria is honest and open with me about her own personal experiences with racism. And suddenly our book becomes very modern. And suddenly, at least for me personally, the way I'm looking at the world is completely changing, because Victoria is trusting me enough to talk to me about her own life and her own experiences. And all of that, all of those discussions, all of that honesty and frankness, I think went into the pages of our book, don't you think?
Yes, every day. And Marie was checking in. First of all, we were writing every day, but every day, the first part of the conversation was Marie just checking in, because every day something else was happening in this country. And it was just like you just want to explode. But I think it's very important to say that just as many times as she had to check in with me and pull me from the edge, there were many days I had to pull her back from the cliff.
I was on the edge.
Just as angry
Oh,
as I was about certain things happening. But the big thing, Julia, is that this is what Belle's mother was trying to prevent. She didn't want her son, excuse me, she didn't want her son to end up on the ground with a knee in his neck. And that's what she knew was coming.
right.
Knew was coming. And so when people judge her and in a negative way, I recently become very defensive of her and Belle, because they weren't passing to be white. They were passing so that Russell, her son, wouldn't one day find himself laying on the ground with a knee in his neck.
And the world in which they lived. I mean, Victoria and I did a huge amount of research into the time period, and like Ida B. Wells's work on the lynchings that were happening, exposing the lynchings that were happening, not just in the South, but in the North at this time period. We were looking at, everyone's starting to learn about the Tulsa massacre, but there were actually situations like that in cities all over our country. And those things were not reported on widely at that time, which is why Ida B. Wells did what she did. And they weren't really part of the record. It's sometimes hard to find those things. And so, but those are things that they would have been aware of, they would have known, and they would have been very, very fearful of the dangers if they continued to live as a Black family. And then, of course, that fear, I think, would have probably accompanied them as they walked the tightrope of passing, because the ramifications, if you were discovered, could have been very, very serious.
I suppose perhaps we've touched on this already, but I was curious about what you think this book shows us about today and what people are experiencing today around identity, around race, around women's roles and the amount of power that women can wield. It's a pretty open question, but is there one thing that you really hope that readers will get from this book?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
wow.
Well, it shows us a lot. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, once it was overturned by the Supreme Court, that set everything in motion. That set everything in motion for their family, and that set everything in motion for what was happening in the country. And then, so the parallel to today for me is the Supreme Court just overturned a major part of the Voting Rights Act. And that is setting some things into motion that's going to take us all the way back. So it's so interesting how the Supreme Court, people who aren't even elected to their positions, can have such a major impact on the country. And I'm just fascinated with that parallel. And I'm a little bit afraid because I know what happened the last time something like that happened. But in terms of, Belle has left a legacy that women can do anything. When I say Black girl magic, I'm talking about the fact that she was doing every single thing. She was juggling so many different things. She was everything that J.P. Morgan wanted her to be. She was taking care of her family. I said this in our last interview. In today's time, she would be their personal ATM. She was just doing everything. Then she was hanging uptown and hanging downtown. And I just don't, that's what women try to do now. They try to do everything. And she was doing it and showing that it could be done. But a lot of her decisions came at great sacrifice.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think too, one of the things that I knew about when we started this book, but I came to appreciate on a totally different level as we were writing it in the circumstances we were writing it in, was, as Victoria was talking about, this period of hope in the years after the Civil War, the Reconstruction-esque time period of which the Civil Rights Act of 1875 kind of is exemplifies in part. that was the world in which Richard Greener and Genevieve Fleet got married and had their children. And at the beginning, it was a time of hope and possibility. And it was actually, if you look back on it, it was a time when if we hadn't overturned the Civil Rights Act, and if we would have kept on that path, it would have been a path of equality without so many years of segregation and resulting rising up racism in response to that. And the way in which that history has repeated and reverberated into the present really became very real and very powerful for me as we were writing this book and watching so much happen in our country. I just couldn't help but think, what if we had stuck with it way back in 1875? Would we be here today? Could things be different? Could we return to a period of hope and possibility? Because it was the erosion of that led to Belle really having to make that choice, or her mother, and then Belle following in the footsteps of having to pass.
Right. I would love to know, given the success of this book and also how much you seem to enjoy each other's company and enjoy writing together, is there another book in your future as a collaboration?
Marie couldn't get rid of me if she wanted to.
You know,
That's it. I will find her and write it. Luckily, I didn't have to do that.
No.
We just couldn't wait to work together again. I just can't wait. I can't wait. I just think that we create our own magic. I don't know. We call ourselves the unlikely twins. Because we do so many.
It look like we're twins, but we are actually twins.
Yeah. So Marie, you want to tell them about our book?
So it's already under contract. It'll be out in about 2 years. It's called at least right now, no promises, but it's called The First Ladies. And it's a story about the friendship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune, who was an educator, an activist in her own right, one of the few women and only Black women to hold a senior position within a presidential administration. She's also sorority sister of Victoria. I'm just going to throw that out there. And these two women became friends long before FDR became president. And they became friends against lots of backlash. People in both communities really did not like to see a white and a Black woman coming together as friends. And they worked together on projects that they hoped would effectuate change in education, in civil rights, sometimes behind the scenes, because that was, they would operate whatever way would work. We just love the idea of exploring the power of friendship, the power of honesty and frankness, to really bridge the divide between us, between people, and as a way, as a stepping stone towards first empathy and understanding, and then ultimately change. So it's a little bit, we're not going to lie, it's a little bit biographical, but
I like to, and there's no record of this, but something I want to explore because of my friendship with Marie and how important she was for me last summer. She gave me a safe place to land with someone who didn't look like me, but could hear me. And so I imagine that Eleanor did that for Mary in many situations, many times. We've been studying and reading up, and I've seen that. And I imagine Eleanor as, and she wasn't, but I imagine her as the first ally, who was in it to win it with Mary. She made some mistakes. She said the wrong things, but that's okay. Because one thing that sometimes people don't want to admit is that in order to get these things accomplished, it's going to take a Black person and a white person to make it happen.
Right. And it's going to take awkwardness and discomfort. And Victoria and I often talk about how the fact that people's discomfort with having those awkward conversations and saying the wrong thing and being honest, that it sometimes it takes that is the impediment towards people coming together and really caring for one another, and then shifting their viewpoints. So Mary and Eleanor are, you know, such an interesting, rare, I think for that time period anyway, example of what that can effectuate in terms of change.
Well, I'm already seeing in the comments that people are really, really excited about that. So I think you have some fans who are just ready for that book when it does come out.
Oh,
Yeah, we are. I'm so excited to explore
I'm
that.
excited, really excited.
I'd love to do a really quick round of reading recommendations. So I always make sure and ask at the end of these interviews if there's anything that you've been reading recently. It could be old, it could be new, it could be something that hasn't quite come out yet. Because I know often, you know, there's some advanced reader copies floating around, but anything in particular that you'd recommend to people?
Yeah, my favorite book this year was Yellow Wife by Shadika Johnson. That book was brutal. Isn't that something to say that's my favorite book? And it was brutal. And there were times I kept telling Marie, you've got to read it because I can't breathe. I could not breathe. That's the only way to describe it, reading that book. It's the only book that, and I'm a big reader, so I don't even remember another time where I wanted to rush to the end to read the end before just so I could know that I could breathe, because I wasn't sure. Amazing book by Shadika Johnson.
It's a great book. I highly, highly recommend that. And if you guys are watching and want to go back, she did an Ask an Author interview with us back in January.
Okay, good.
I had already had it in my stack, but Victoria kept texting me about it, so I moved it to the top of my stack. And I have to agree. I mean, it's really hard to read it sometimes, as I'm sure you know, Julia. It's very painful, but it's so powerful at the same time. And you know, we're so very deep in the conversations about passing and what it means and how very complicated and textured it is. And there's elements of that in it too, which really resonated with me in a different way that I didn't expect. I thought that was wonderful, a wonderful book. And we both just finished The Other Black Girl too, I have to say.
We both just finished.
We don't intentionally have our own book club, but we actually kind of do.
You know, if it works.
Yeah, it's which was excellent too. Really good.
Wonderful. Well, I would love to make sure that people know, first of all, that they can get your book at all bookstores. And we've also got a couple of links to bookshop.org if you guys are interested. In the comments, you can pick up a copy. I've seen a lot of people saying that they're interested in making sure that they get this book and bump it up to the top of their to be read pile. But if people want to follow you online, make sure that they keep up to date on all the news, maybe make sure that they know what's coming up with your next book together. Where would they follow you? Maybe Victoria, if you want to go first.
Yes, I'm Victoria Christopher Murray on everything, on Facebook, on Instagram and Twitter, everywhere. And then on my website, victoriachristophermurray.com, if you sign up for my mailing list, then you'll always be up to date on everything that's coming out. So just Victoria Christopher Murray. I am so uncreative. That's all I use.
It's easy.
I'm pretty similar. Marie Benedict. Usually it's easier to do author Marie Benedict, both on my website and also on Instagram, although I'm sure there's not a lot of Marie Benedicts. You can find me. And Facebook. I am not on Twitter. I'm not as tech savvy as Victoria or as socially media active as she is. But we do have stuff on all of those places about events we're doing. Articles that have come out. We've been so fortunate to be profiled in like the Washington Post and NPR, and and of course Good Morning America, which has been amazing.
You'll find all the videos from that and all the things we did. That was so much fun. That was so amazing.
Amazing. So
fantastic. Well, I think maybe we'll give Sandy the last word here. Sandy commented, "You guys are awesome." And I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for joining me. And I really, really loved the book. So this has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having us.
It's my favorite city in the whole world. So
I love it too.
I love to come visit when you're able to.
Yes.
Exactly. One of these days.
One of these days. Thank you guys so much for watching.
Thanks, Julia.
Be back next week.
Bye.